The sun leaned heavy over the wide plains, its light spilling like molten copper across the tall grasses that swayed under the push of a restless wind. A cabin leaned at the edge of that endless stretch, its timbers worn gray from years of storms and silence. Beside it, a figure stood tall, shadow etched against the fading horizon, the kind of man whose presence filled the land as much as the mountains did in the distance. His shirt was frayed at the seams, dust clung to his boots, and his jaw carried the quiet resolve of someone who had buried more dreams than he had spoken. He looked like he belonged to the land, like he had been carved out of it, rough and enduring. She came to him out of that golden light, steps slow, hesitant, as if each pace weighed more than the one before. Her dress was plain and travel-worn, the fabric stained by dust and sweat, and her hair tangled from days under the open sky. Yet there was a fire in her eyes, something untamed that had not yet been broken by hardship or hunger. She stopped before him, breath shallow, lips trembling as though words would cost her more than silence. The air hung heavy with the smell of earth and smoke, with the promise of thunder far off in the hills. He looked down at her, his gaze sharp, searching, as if trying to read a truth hidden behind her dirt-streaked cheeks. Her voice broke the silence, low and unsteady, as though confessing a sin. She whispered she hadn't bathed in months. The words carried shame, but also defiance, a daring challenge thrown between them like a knife across a table. It was the kind of truth only the wild could force from someone, raw, unvarnished, and aching with vulnerability. She lowered her eyes, expecting rejection, a step back, maybe even laughter that cut like a blade. But what came was laughter of another kind, deep and warm, rolling out of him like a river breaking free from stone. It wasn't cruel or mocking, but full, alive, as if he had been waiting for something real in a world where men and women alike wore masks too heavy to bear. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the rough heat of his breath, the dust and sun clinging to his skin. His hand found her jaw, not gentle but certain, and before doubt could rise, before her confession could hang longer in the air, he kissed her. It was not polished or careful, but hungry, unrelenting. The kind of kiss that claimed the space between fear and desire. Her chest pressed against his, and for a moment the world shrank to nothing but the taste of dust, sweat, and something deeper neither of them had spoken yet. Behind them, the wind rattled the loose boards of the cabin. The prairie stretched endlessly, lonely and unwelcoming. But in that stolen instant it felt alive, as though it had been holding its breath for this meeting. The kiss broke, leaving her lips parted, her breath fast, her heart stumbling against her ribs. He looked at her with a fire that told her he hadn't laughed in years, not like that, and that somehow her rawness, her blunt honesty, had struck something truer than any beauty or lie ever could. But there was more in his eyes too, something darker, something unsaid. She felt it as sure as the storm crawling over the horizon. She pulled back a step, her fingers still trembling where they had clung to his shirt. The land was no place for tenderness, not for long. It was a place that demanded sacrifice, demanded blood, demanded the kind of choices that stripped people to their bones. Her confession might have been met with warmth this time, but she could feel the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on them both. He looked at her like a man standing on the edge of something vast, unsure whether to leap or to turn back, and she knew, deep down, that whatever lay ahead would not let them stay as they were now. The thunder rolled closer, low and heavy, and the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and distant smoke. She turned her face toward the horizon, seeing more than storm clouds. There was danger out there, something creeping closer with each passing hour. The kiss lingered like a flame inside her, but it was fragile against the vastness of what loomed. His hand brushed hers, rough knuckles grazing her skin, but he didn't hold on. Not yet. The land would test them both, strip them bare, and only then would they know whether hunger, laughter, and longing were enough to survive what was coming. She looked back at him, lips still tingling, and whispered something else, softer this time, words he barely caught over the wind. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as the meaning sank in. Whatever she had carried to him out of the wilderness was more than confession or longing. It was a truth that could shatter the fragile warmth between them. The storm broke in the distance with a jagged line of lightning, and in that flash, he realized the kiss they had shared was only the beginning, a fragile spark against the wildfire of what was coming. And before he could ask her to repeat those words, before he could decide whether to trust or to fear, the night rushed in, swallowing the last of the sun, leaving them standing together, caught between desire and a danger neither of them had yet spoken aloud. The storm moved closer through the night, its growl echoing against the mountains like a restless animal pacing in the dark. The cabin creaked under the push of the wind, and the field around them bent and swayed like it was bowing to something greater than both man and woman. He stood by the door, his hand resting against the frame, his eyes fixed on her as if searching for something she had not yet given. She sat by the small fire inside, her shoulders hunched forward, her hair catching the faint orange glow. There was silence between them, but it wasn't the silence of strangers. It was the silence of people holding words too heavy to speak aloud. The land had taught them both the price of silence. It had a way of stripping people bare until only truth remained. She knew he was waiting for her to explain the whisper she had breathed into his chest just before the night took the sun. He hadn't asked. Not with words, but his eyes had carried the weight of a question too sharp to ignore. Yet she kept her gaze on the fire, letting the smoke sting her eyes instead. She had carried the secret for too long to set it down so easily. Out here, truths had a way of cutting deeper than any blade, and once spoken, they could not be taken back. He moved toward her, the boards creaking under his boots. He lowered himself to the stool across from her, the firelight throwing his face into hard lines. His hands were scarred, dirt ground deep into his knuckles, and she wondered what kind of work or fight had marked him. He was not the kind of man who filled silence with chatter. Every word he spoke seemed measured, weighed, as though he knew what it meant to waste them. She wanted to tell him everything, to let the secret spill into the flames, but she could feel the storm pressing on the walls, reminding her that timing could mean life or death. She looked up, finally meeting his eyes. There was hunger there still, but something else now, something wary, as though he had already begun to guess the truth. She turned her gaze to the window, where the lightning broke the sky wide open for a heartbeat, before the darkness swallowed it whole again. The prairie stretched beyond the glass, endless and unforgiving. She thought of the miles she had walked to get here, of the nights spent curled beneath the cold sky with only the sound of coyotes to keep her from forgetting she was still alive. Each step had been driven by the hope that when she finally reached this cabin, she would find him waiting. And she had, but the weight of her secret pressed heavier now, because she knew once he heard it, the kiss they had shared might not mean the same thing to him. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his voice low, steady. He asked her what she had meant, his words carrying no anger, only a kind of quiet demand. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, her heart thrashing against her ribs. She wanted to answer, but the words caught in her chest. Instead, she shook her head, whispering that it wasn't time yet. His jaw tightened at that, but he said nothing more. He leaned back, staring into the flames, the silence between them turning heavier. She knew he was not a man who liked mysteries. The land was harsh, unforgiving, and mystery out here often meant danger. And yet he did not push her further. Maybe he sensed that if she spoke too soon, it would ruin whatever fragile thread had been woven between them. The storm broke near midnight. Rain lashed against the roof, the wind tearing at the walls as if trying to rip the cabin from the earth. The fire flickered low, fighting against the drafts that slipped through the cracks in the wood. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her eyes darting to the shadows that moved across the walls. He remained steady, his silhouette unmoving by the window, watching the storm as if it carried something more than rain and thunder. She could not shake the feeling that he was waiting for something, or someone. When the worst of the storm finally passed, the night grew quiet again, too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses into your skin and makes you notice every sound. She lay on the cot in the corner, her eyes open, listening to the drip of water through the roof and the soft crack of cooling embers. Sleep did not come. The whisper of her own words from earlier echoed in her head, the weight of them heavier now than ever. She turned her face to the wall, wondering how much longer she could keep the truth buried before it swallowed her whole. Morning came gray and heavy, the fields washed flat under the storm's weight. He was already outside when she stepped from the cabin, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth. He stood near the barn, shoulders squared, axe in hand, splitting logs as though the act itself was a way to keep questions at bay. She watched him for a while, the steady rhythm of his work both comforting and unsettling. He glanced at her once, his expression unreadable, then went back to the wood. She wanted to go to him, to place her hand against his chest and tell him everything she had carried across the miles, but her feet stayed rooted. Something held her back, something deeper than fear. It was as though the land itself was warning her that secrets once spoken could never be unspoken. The day stretched long. She tried to keep busy, mending the torn sleeve of her dress, gathering what little food remained in the storeroom, sweeping the dirt from the floor. But each task felt hollow, like moving pieces on a board without knowing the game. Every time her eyes found him, she felt the tension twist tighter inside her. She remembered the kiss, the way his laugh had broken the heaviness of her confession, but now it seemed like a fragile spark against the weight of what hung between them. Late in the afternoon, a sound carried across the prairie, a distant rumble, not thunder this time, but something heavier, something alive. He froze, his head lifting, eyes narrowing toward the horizon. She felt the air shift, thick with unease. He set down the axe and wiped the sweat from his brow, his shoulders stiff. Without a word, he stepped toward the cabin, his boots thudding against the wet earth. She followed his gaze, but the land stretched empty, wide and bare, the kind of emptiness that hides more than it reveals. Still the sound lingered, carried on the wind. He told her to stay inside, his voice firm but calm, and she obeyed, though her heart hammered with questions. She watched through the window as he walked out into the field, his posture rigid, his hand resting on the handle of the knife at his belt. The prairie swallowed him quickly, the tall grass bending around his form until he was only a shadow against the horizon. She pressed her palm to the glass, straining to see, her breath fogging the pain. Whatever lay out there, it was not the storm, not the wind. It was something else, something that had been waiting. Minutes dragged into an hour. The sky darkened again with the promise of another storm, but he did not return. Her chest tightened, fear coiling deep in her stomach. She paced the cabin, each creak of the floorboards louder than the last. She told herself he would come back, that men like him always did. But the land had taught her better than to believe in promises. The kiss they had shared, the laughter that had carried warmth into the cold evening, felt distant now, fragile against the weight of the silence pressing from the fields. As dusk bled into night, she heard it again, the rumble, closer this time, accompanied by a faint flicker of movement along the horizon. Her breath caught. She stepped back from the window, her pulse pounding in her ears. She whispered his name, though he was nowhere near enough to hear it. The secret she had carried, the truth she had locked behind her lips, burned hotter in her chest. She realized then that she might not have time left to decide when to speak it. The land, the storm, and whatever moved out there in the fading light were all conspiring to force her hand. She clutched the blanket around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the window, waiting. The night deepened, the air thick with the scent of rain and the echo of something unseen, and as the first shadow moved into view at the edge of the field, she knew the moment she had been running from was no longer hers to hold back. The figure at the edge of the field barely moved at first, more shadow than flesh, blending into the tall grass that shifted under the evening wind. She pressed her hand against the window frame, her breath short, her eyes refusing to blink, as if any moment of blindness would let the figure vanish or multiply into many. The land had always played tricks on the eyes, especially at dusk, but she knew this was no trick. The storm had not yet broken again, yet there was a weight in the air heavier than thunder. She could feel it in her chest, the kind of pressure that warns of danger long before it takes shape. She thought of him, the way he had walked out into that same grass hours earlier, his back straight, his hand resting near the knife at his belt. He had not returned. The silence of the cabin felt sharper without him. She wanted to believe he was out there still, keeping watch, ready to return the moment she needed him. But a darker thought gnawed at her. What if the figure she saw now was tied to his absence? What if he had never made it back from the horizon? Her throat tightened, and she clutched the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her body shivering though the fire still gave off heat. The figure shifted at last, stepping forward, not enough to be seen clearly, but enough to prove that it was real. Her pulse raced and she moved away from the window, pressing her back against the wall, straining to listen. The wind carried faint sounds, something like the creak of leather, the dull thud of boots against damp soil. She closed her eyes, forcing her breath to slow, but it was no use. Every nerve screamed that the night was no longer hers alone. She thought of the whisper she had given him, the truth she had carried through storms and hunger, and she felt the weight of it pressing harder now. If the figure outside was tied to that truth, then silence would not keep her safe any longer. A door creaked, but not the cabin door. It was the barn. Her eyes shot open and she froze, straining to hear again. The barn stood no more than 30 paces from where she now sat, its roof patched with uneven boards. its doors hanging crooked on rusted hinges. The sound had come from there, soft but certain, like wood shifting under a careful hand. She remembered how he had sharpened the axe earlier, how he had stacked the logs with measured strength, how his eyes had narrowed toward the horizon. He had known something was coming, though he hadn't said it aloud. Now she knew too. She forced herself to move, her steps careful across the floorboards, her breath held tight in her chest. The cabin's small rifle leaned in the corner, worn and rusted but still deadly enough if handled steady. Her hands shook as she reached for it, the weight unfamiliar but grounding. She had not fired a weapon in years, but the memory of it lingered in her bones. Her father had once placed a gun in her hands, telling her the land respected no one, and survival belonged to those willing to fight for it. She had hated the feel of cold iron then, but tonight she found herself grateful for its presence. The barn door groaned again, louder this time, and she flinched. Shadows moved across the yard, and she raised the rifle, pressing the butt tight against her shoulder, her finger brushing the trigger. She wanted to shout, to demand that whoever was out there show themselves, but the words caught in her throat. The prairie had its own way of answering bold voices, and sometimes the answer came in blood. Instead, she held her breath, waiting, the silence stretching like a rope pulled too tight. Then a shape emerged, stepping from the barn into the dim light of the fading fire glow. It wasn't him. The figure was taller, broader, the movements too deliberate, too sure of themselves. The man stopped halfway across the yard, his face still shadowed, but his posture carried the kind of confidence that comes from being unafraid of who might be watching. He turned his head slowly toward the cabin, and though she could not see his eyes, she felt his gaze pierce straight through the walls. Her heart hammered, and she steadied the rifle against the window frame, her finger trembling on the trigger. The man raised a hand then, not in surrender, but in a slow, mocking greeting. He knew she was there. He wanted her to see him. Her breath shook, and in that moment a memory returned. The secret she had whispered into his chest, the reason she had crossed the wilderness, the weight that had chased her through the night. She knew this man, not his face but his presence. He was tied to the truth she carried, the danger she had hoped to outrun. Her knees weakened and she almost dropped the rifle, but she held on. The man lowered his hand and stepped back into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared, leaving only silence behind. The barn door slammed shut, rattling in the wind, and she knew he had not left, only retreated deeper. She didn't sleep that night. She sat by the fire with the rifle across her lap, every creak of the cabin and howl of the wind turning her nerves raw. She thought of him, wondering where he had gone, if he was lying hurt in the grass or if he had stumbled upon something too dangerous to face alone. She wanted to believe he would return, but as dawn bled into the sky, empty and gray, the space beside her remained cold. The prairie stretched wide outside, quiet now, but heavy with unseen eyes. She knew the man in the barn was waiting, and the longer she stayed silent, the closer the danger crept. By midday, she forced herself outside. The rifle stayed in her hands, her eyes scanning the field, the barn, the tree line beyond. The land looked the same as it always did, endless, empty, uncaring. But she felt the shift in her bones. Something had broken in the balance, and now every step forward felt like walking into a trap. She circled the barn, her ears straining for sound, but the silence pressed hard, giving nothing away. The door stood closed, its surface scarred by years of storms, but she could almost feel the weight of someone inside. She lifted the rifle, but she didn't move closer. She wasn't ready. Not yet. The hours crawled. She busied her hands with chores she barely registered, sweeping, mending, checking the firewood, all while her thoughts circled back to him. If he didn't return by nightfall, she told herself, she would have to choose. She could not stay in the cabin with the shadow of the man in the barn pressing on her every breath. She thought of the kiss, the laugh that had filled the room, the way his eyes had burned with hunger and something unspoken. If he was alive, she would find him. If he was not, she would face what remained. Either way, the land would demand more of her than silence soon. As evening settled once more, the sky bruised purple with the promise of rain. She saw movement again at the horizon. Not one figure this time, but many. Small at first, like smudges on the wide canvas of the prairie, but growing clearer as the light thinned. Riders, at least 3, maybe more, their horses moving steady, their silhouettes sharp against the fading sun. Her stomach twisted, and she stepped back from the window, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break her ribs. She clutched the rifle tighter, the weight of it suddenly too heavy. The truth she had carried across the land, The secret she had whispered was no longer something she could hide. The riders were coming, and whatever their purpose, it was tied to her. The barn door shifted again, creaking softly, as if answering the sight of the riders with its own dark presence. She froze, her breath caught, torn between two shadows, what waited inside the barn, and what approached from the horizon. The storm broke once more above them, rain spilling across the land, lightning cutting the sky into jagged pieces. In that light, she felt the weight of everything closing in. She thought of him wherever he was, and she knew the night ahead would decide more than whether she survived. It would decide whether the hunger in his kiss, the laughter that had stirred her heart, could withstand the truth that was about to come crashing through their fragile silence. The rain came down in sheets, blurring the horizon and turning the prairie into a shifting sea of silver and shadow. She pressed her back against the cabin wall, the rifle heavy in her hands, her breath ragged as she tried to listen through the roar of the storm. The riders had not vanished with the rain. Their silhouettes still moved in the distance, slow but steady, drawing closer with each flash of lightning. The storm was no shield. It was only cover, and she knew it could hide their approach until they were nearly at her door. The barn door thudded once in the wind, then stilled. Her stomach tightened. She could not tell if the noise came from the storm or from the man inside, but she knew he was still there. She could feel it in the way the air seemed to thicken near the barn, the way her skin prickled when her eyes lingered too long on the darkened boards. Whoever he was, he had chosen to wait rather than strike. That patience frightened her more than anything. A storm passes quickly. A man who waits does not. Her thoughts circled back to him, the one who had kissed her, the one who had walked into the field and never returned. The land could swallow a man whole in the space of an hour. Coyotes, flooded creeks, hidden gullies. Yet none of those dangers felt as sharp as what she sensed now. If he had fallen, if he was out there lying in the tall grass with the rain washing over him, then the weight of her secret would crush her for good. But if he still lived, if he had found what she feared he might, then the night would not end without blood. She forced herself to move. She crossed the cabin to the small window that faced the riders. Lightning split the sky again, and for a heartbeat she saw them clearly. 5, not 3. Their hats pulled low against the storm, their coats flapping like black wings. They rode in a staggered line, steady and sure, as though the rain meant nothing to them. She bit down on the edge of her lip until she tasted iron. These were not men wandering lost in the storm. They were coming with purpose. They were coming for her. The truth she had carried across the wilderness burned hotter in her chest. It had driven her feet mile after mile. It had stripped her of rest and peace, and now it had drawn danger straight to the cabin that had been her only refuge. She wanted to scream it out, to pour the words into the storm and be done with them. But she knew the land would not forgive such weakness. The words had to be placed carefully, like a blade, or they would cut her down before she ever had the chance to fight. The storm deepened, the wind howling through the cracks in the cabin walls, shaking the shutters on the window. She crouched low, clutching the rifle tight, her knuckles white against the wood. The riders slowed as they neared, their horses picking their way through the mud, and she realized with a sinking dread that they would reach the yard before long. Her eyes darted toward the barn again. Lightning flashed once more, and for an instant she thought she saw movement. An arm, a shift of a shoulder, before the dark swallowed it back. She did not know if the man inside was ally or enemy. All she knew was that she was surrounded, and the silence she had clung to was no shield anymore. Her breath caught when she heard the sound she had been dreading. Hooves, close now, squelching through the soaked earth, the creak of saddles and the low murmur of voices barely audible through the rain. They were here. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows, her heart slamming in her chest, her finger trembling near the trigger. The first horse stopped just beyond the cabin wall. She could hear the animal snort, hear the rider shift in the saddle, then a voice low and steady carrying over the storm. It spoke her name. Her knees nearly gave. The sound of it cut sharper than any blade. Few men alive knew her name now. Fewer still would dare use it here. The rifle wavered in her hands, and she pressed her lips together to keep from crying out. They knew. Whoever these riders were, they had not come searching blindly. They had come for her, and they had not come alone. The barn door groaned again. She whipped her head toward it, her breath sharp. For a moment the storm seemed to pause, holding its breath along with her. The riders shifted outside, their voices rising just enough for her to catch the tone. Impatience, irritation, but not fear. Whoever led them believed the land already belonged to them. That arrogance chilled her more than the rain that seeped through the cracks. She thought again of him. His laugh, his kiss, the way he had stepped into the night without hesitation. She wanted him to burst through the storm now, to cut through the circle closing around her. But the prairie gave no sign of him. Only the riders, only the man in the barn, only her, trapped between the storm and the weight of her secret. The hoofbeats shifted, circling. She heard another voice, this one harsher, calling out to the others. A command. The sound of it made her stomach twist. She had heard it once before, long ago, in another place, spoken over the crack of fire and the cries of those who had fallen. She pressed her fist against her mouth to keep from gasping. That voice was tied to the truth she carried, the reason she had crossed the wilderness with nothing but hunger and hope to drive her forward, the reason she had whispered to him that night, when she had believed the cabin's walls could still protect her. The voice outside belonged to the past she had tried to bury, and now it was here to claim her. Her breath grew shallow, her body trembling as the storm whipped harder against the cabin. The riders had dismounted now. She could hear the thud of boots in the mud, the rasp of leather, the muted ring of iron. They moved with purpose, spreading around the cabin like a noose tightening. She clutched the rifle tighter, her mind screaming at her to act, but her body frozen by the weight of too many choices. If she fired, the storm would carry the sound for miles, but so would the blood. If she stayed silent, they would come closer, and the man in the barn might strike before she could see him coming. If he had not already slipped away into the dark. The floor creaked beneath her feet as she shifted, and the sound seemed to echo too loudly. She flinched, her pulse quickening, sure they would hear. Another voice rose outside, closer now, calling her name again. Softer this time, almost coaxing. The tone carried a twisted familiarity, like someone who believed they had a claim on her. She shook her head fiercely, tears stinging her eyes, though she would not let them fall. They did not own her. They never had. But the land had no sympathy for the truth. Only strength. The storm cracked open above her, lightning splitting the sky so bright it burned her eyes. In that flash, she saw the riders clearly through the window. 5 figures spread wide, their faces hidden by rain and shadow, but their intent written in every line of their bodies. They were ready. They were waiting, and she was the center of whatever storm had brought them here. Her chest heaved, her heart hammering against her ribs. As she raised the rifle and aimed through the window, her finger brushing the trigger. The suspense tightened around her like a rope, pulling her breath thin, her body taut. She knew the next heartbeat would break everything open. The riders, the barn, the truth she had carried across the wilderness. All of it was about to collide, and the cabin's fragile walls would not hold forever. The storm raged with a force that shook the earth. But it was not the thunder or the rain that held her still. It was the men outside, circling like wolves, their voices cutting through the roar of the night. She could feel them closing in, the weight of their footsteps pressing against the walls of the cabin. The rifle trembled in her hands as she aimed at the window, her finger ready on the trigger. One shot could break the silence, but it could also bring every shadow crashing down upon her. Then the barn door burst open. The sound tore through the storm like a crack of iron against stone. A figure stepped out, broad and steady, the lantern glow behind him throwing his outline sharp against the rain. Her breath caught. It was him, the man she had feared lost in the prairie, the one who had kissed her in the firelight, the one who had carried her silence with laughter instead of scorn. He had not vanished. He had been waiting in the dark, holding back until the moment mattered most. The riders stilled, their boots sinking into the mud, their hands hovering near weapons. One called out, his voice sharp and commanding, but the man from the barn answered with nothing but the weight of his presence. Lightning split the sky above, and for a heartbeat all their faces were revealed. She saw the lines of cruelty etched into the leader's mouth, the cold determination in the others, and she knew the truth had arrived with them. They were here for her secret, the one she had carried across the wilderness, the one she had whispered but never explained. She could no longer keep it buried. She stepped from the cabin, the rain soaking her hair, the rifle heavy in her arms. Her voice trembled at first, but it grew steady as she spoke. She told them what they had come for, the truth she had carried all this way. She told them what had been stolen from her, what had been destroyed, and why she had run until her feet bled. She named the leader, his crimes, and the reason he had chased her across the endless land. The words cut through the storm like blades, and for the first time the riders shifted uneasily. Her silence had shielded her before, but her voice now struck deeper. The leader laughed, low and bitter, trying to turn her words into nothing. But the man from the barn stepped closer, his knife flashing in the stormlight. His presence alone silenced the mockery. She felt the air tighten, the storm holding its breath again as the standstill stretched long. She braced herself for the rush, for the clash of steel and the crack of gunfire. Her hands shook, but she did not lower the rifle. The first shot rang out, not hers. The riders flinched, horses rearing in the mud. The man from the barn moved fast, a shadow cutting through the storm, his blade flashing once, then again. She fired into the chaos, the rifle bucking against her shoulder, the sound swallowed by thunder. The yard erupted, the storm and the fight twisting together until she could not tell which roared louder. Her body moved without thought, driven by the memory of survival her father had burned into her long ago. When the clash finally broke, the silence that followed felt louder than the storm itself. The riders were scattered, some fallen, others fleeing into the darkness of the prairie. The leader lay in the mud, his power gone, his voice silenced at last. She lowered the rifle, her chest heaving, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The rain washed the blood from the yard, carrying it into the earth. She felt the weight of her secret lift, not because it no longer mattered, but because it had finally been spoken, finally faced. He stood across from her, the knife still in his hand, his chest rising and falling with the fight's aftermath. Their eyes met through the storm, and she saw the same hunger in him as before, but it was changed now. It was tempered by understanding, by the fire they had both walked through. She dropped the rifle, letting it sink into the mud, and stepped toward him. Her legs nearly gave out, but he caught her, his arms steady, grounding her against the chaos. For the first time in years, she felt safe enough to breathe. The prairie stretched wide around them, still endless, still unforgiving, but different now. The danger had not vanished completely. On land like this, it never did, but she was no longer running. She was no longer alone. She had faced the men who hunted her. She had spoken the truth she had carried, and she had survived. When the storm finally eased, the cabin stood battered but unbroken, its walls scarred but standing. She and he worked in silence to set things right, gathering what they could, tending to wounds, mending what the fight had torn. Their silence now was not heavy with secrets but filled with a quiet strength. She knew words would come later, when the fire burned low and the night held only them. For now survival spoke loudest, and it was enough. Days passed, the prairie washing itself clean under the wide sky. The riders never returned. The land carried their shadows away, scattering them like dust in the wind. She and he tended the cabin, the barn, the fields, their hands steady, their eyes meeting often in the simple rhythm of work. She found herself laughing again, soft at first, then stronger, and his answering smile carried no hunger for secrets, only a hunger for life. At night, when the fire burned low, she let herself rest against him, the storm only a memory beyond the walls. She thought of the miles she had walked, the night spent under a sky that gave no comfort, and she felt the difference now. The truth she had once feared to speak had not destroyed her. It had given her a place to stand. She knew the land would test them again. Storms would come, hunger would press, danger would wait at the edges, but she also knew they would face it together. The kiss they had shared that first night had been the spark, but what followed was stronger. It was built not on silence or fear, but on survival, on trust, on the hard-won truth that neither the land nor the men who hunted her could take away. As the sun rose one morning, painting the sky in golden fire, she stepped outside and breathed deep. The prairie spread wide and endless, still wild, still dangerous, but no longer empty. She felt the weight of the past fall away like dust from her boots. He joined her, his hand brushing hers, steady and warm. They stood together, two shadows against the vast horizon, unbroken, unafraid. The cabin would hold them, the land would test them, but the storm had passed. She had found more than survival here. She had found her place, her voice, and a man who met her truth not with fear but with strength. And in that, she found what she had been searching for all along. The prairie stretched out before them, a road without end, but for the first time, she did not dread the path ahead. She welcomed it, and as the wind swept across the grass, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of change, she knew the journey was no longer hers alone. It was theirs, and that was enough.